Everyone. Thank you all for being here today. If you don't mind, as you grab coffee and snacks, if you would just be finding a seat. We're so excited to have you here today. For those of you I haven't had a chance yet to meet, my name is Erin Cullers, and I'm the daughter of Judd and Gayla, and we're just so excited to have you here at Heritage Cattle Company for the 2023 International ABBA Field Day. Although my dad is unable to be here today, he'd still also like to welcome you all, so if you wouldn't mind turning your attention to the screens, we have just a short video.
Well, good morning and welcome to Heritage Cattle Company, and more importantly, welcome to the first International Brahman Field Day that is being held during the Houston Livestock Show. My family's so excited that you're here. I think that you're in for a real treat today. We've got some fabulous guest speakers here. We've got friends from, I think, 12 or 13 different countries that are here represented. So take a minute and look to your left and look to your right. And if there's someone you don't know, by the end of the day, make it a point to meet those people. Everyone here, we have a common interest in a bond of American Brahman cattle. And I think that as we pull together and as we unite country to country, there's so many things we can do great for this breed. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'll be judging the female Brahman show as well as the male Brahman show. And I hope you can make it over to NRG Arena, and look forward to seeing you there. Again, thanks for being here today. It means so much to me and my family. Have a blessed day.
Our first speaker today, Mrs. Kylie Patterson, is a native of San Antonio, Texas. She grew up on a small Brahman operation where she and her sister competitively exhibited their cattle across the country. Kylie attended Blinn College in Brenham, Texas, before transferring to Oklahoma State University. She was an integral part of the highly successful livestock judging team and was the first woman in the history of the century-old event to win high individual at the national contest in Louisville, Kentucky, in both junior and senior college. OSU was also the record-breaking national team in 2019. Previously, she was an assistant coach of the 2021-2022 Texas A&M team that won 3 of the 4 national contests. Currently, she is a business partner on an innovative online video judging practice platform, livestockjudging.com, and works as a territory sales lead for Hershey in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So if you'd all please join me in welcoming Kylie.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I tell you what, from the moment Judd and Gayla asked me to be a part of this event, I was beyond excited because I can't think of a better opportunity to encompass just an elite group of cattlemen from across the world for the same reason, and honoring the Brahman breed and being here for, the most prestigious Brahman event in the world. And so it's an honor for me to be here. Today we're going to be talking about breeding cattle selection, which kind of seems like an interesting topic here again, because I just feel so honored to be around all of you. Like I said, I can't talk enough highly things in terms of your prestige and what you bring to the breed in each one of your countries, and ultimately to Brahman across the world. So as we start diving into selection criteria, I think it's important to remember that regardless of your operations goals, whether you're just doing commercial cattle or if you're heavy into making elite show cattle, we still have to make sure that these cattle serve a real world purpose. And so when we start talking about selection criteria, kind of broke it down into things that I feel like from a priority standpoint need to be at the forefront. And so we start talking about functionality, and to me that needs to be the number one thing when we're selecting elite Brahman cattle. And so that's going to encompass some structural correctness and some volume. And some things that I always like to tell whoever I'm speaking to whenever I'm going out and looking at ranches, or if I'm talking to my judging students, is when we think about building a house, right? In order for that to be a long-lasting unit, we need to make sure the foundation is right and the foundation is sturdy. And even though we love all of the extra bells and whistles when it comes to look and power, the things we have to make sure that we have in check first are structural correctness and having the right kind of body volume that can then fuel some added power. And then if we can make them neat-looking show cattle on top of it, man, that's just an extra. And so making sure we have functionality at the forefront in selection is a priority. And so next we talk about some production efficiency stuff. And so that's going to go into, can that cow withstand her lifetime? Can we go out, turn her on pasture? Can she maintain herself without extra supplemental maintenance along the way? And so some things that go into play, and I know it's different depending on your region that you are across the world, but some moderation, some fleshing ability, again, having the right kind of body type to sustain herself. And then we go into performance, and it might be more gender specific, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're making sure our beef cattle have the right kind of vigor, the right kind of grow, and the right kind of muscularity to maximize their input, to maximize whatever our goal is. And then if we can make them powerful, have some width and dimension, and of course, balance and look at the end of it, then we're really cooking with gas. And so that's kind of, I guess, as we go along today, the priorities that I think are important. And when you go and you select cattle for your ranches, when you're evaluating cattle at Houston and you're trying to think of your next big investment, let's make sure they're good real world cattle first and then do the extras on top of it. And so functionality, what is it? So it also can be loosely referred to as practical or useful. So those are kind of synonyms that we can interchange. If you hear a judge speaking on one of those things, they're touching on the key points of functionality. And so defining functionality in livestock is going to be the ability for an animal to combine feet and leg soundness with total body volume to provide in a production setting. So essentially encompassing the right kind of foundation that you need to build your house to make a long-lasting beef cow. So some major points to remember in soundness. Everything goes back to a 45-degree angle. So the angle that you want their shoulder to be set in, the angle that you want their hock to be, is all going to go back to a 45-degree angle. So if you're a mathematic kind of wizard, that's a good key point to stand on. And so spine flexibility is also something that probably doesn't get talked about enough. And I think in the Brahman breed, we've strived so hard to make them so level top, so dead level out of their hip. And maybe along the way, we've forgotten about the importance of looseness of structure. And so even though correct lines and a really strong top line is exceptional for balance, oftentimes those cattle maybe don't move out as loosely in terms of their hock or their shoulder, and that's maybe where the compensation is lying. And so those really elite ones can combine both things, but it's important to remember that we're not just single trading in our selection criteria for just a strong top line, and they still are loose in terms of their joint work and loose in terms of their structure. That way we don't have any causes in motion in terms of them wanting to roll up in their loin or elevate in their spine. So it's always important to remember that these cattle still need to be flexible. Also, I think a key point and something the Brahman breed over probably the past 5 or 6 years has done just an exceptional job of doing is continuing to improve foot quality. And so again, goes back to building a house, starting at a strong foundation, making sure those cattle as calves have the right kind of foot shape and they're square to the outer edges of their hoof wall, they're even in terms of their toes and have the right kind of depth of heel to withstand themselves when they get up to a very heavy weight. And so again, foot quality, a uniform foot design also becomes very highly heritable as well. And so we touch down to curled toes and bulls where their feet are kind of scissored or maybe not as uniform. It's important to remember if you make a big purchase on a bull and maybe his feet are not as great, well, that's going to represent 50% of your total genetic pool in that next calf crop. And so always remembering to make an emphasis and making sure we're making the right points in terms of soundness. And so, again, we touched on some breed-specific problems. But one thing I can say, evaluating Brahman cattle over the years in the judging sector, is we have done just an exceptional job making a push to have stouter, square-hooved cattle. And so that's something that I think we all should be really proud of. And so just some differences in terms of front structure to put kind of it in perspective from a diagram perspective is so the ideal. We talk about a 45-degree angle, right? And so the way that goes in terms of their shoulder structure is you want to start at the top of their shoulder where the point of their scapula would be, and then you want to trace it down right here to where their point is. And so if that sets at a 45-degree angle, then accordingly, their length of stride out of their front end is going to be a lot longer. And so that's going to facilitate some curvature built into their knee and allow that calf to be able to get out and go. And so when you're selecting babies, making sure the angle to their shoulder is right is really key because, again, it's no secret. We know Brahmins get really heavy, and that'll be the first thing to give as we start putting more weight on these cattle. We start talking about them being too straight, and that's taking their whole shoulder blade and pushing it up, and then the angle from right here at the top to the point of their shoulder gets forward, and then we can see if we draw the line, that's going to limit the amount of step they can take out of their front end. At the same time, though, and maybe not something we see a whole lot in Brahman cattle, we need to avoid things that get too long-toed or too much set or curvature built into their knee. That can be another thing that might sacrifice their structural integrity. But more often than not, this will be the biggest issue that you'll see in Brahman cattle. And if you guys have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I'd love to ask. And then as we start evaluating things from the front view, again, we talk about normal. We want from the point of their shoulder all the way down that animal to be square and them to be really even and uniform. We start running into some problems with them being knock-kneed or coming in at their knee and then wanting to toe out up front. That's not going to be more ideal. And again, that's going to run into some structural integrity issues, and oftentimes you'll see some foot issues as well when we have this bend in terms of their knee in the wrong way. In the same breath, we don't want them to be bow-legged up front because oftentimes when you get these cattle that want to put pressure to the outside of their hoof wall and bow in terms of their knee, you'll see a lot more coarseness in terms of their knee joint. That calf won't be as sound. And again, when we start talking about bull selection, you go and you turn out a bull, you have him covering your cows. That's not going to be as hardy. He won't have the same amount of vigor, the same amount of get out and go. And so front structure in those regards becomes really important. And oftentimes when you see issues like them being knock-kneed or towing out up front or being bow-legged from the front view, those will correlate to their shoulder angle being off. So when we push their shoulder blade forward, we make them straighter up front, we'll see compensations in terms of their front foot placement. So all of those things kind of go together. And then as we see rear structure issues from behind, again, normal would be very square, very even, very uniform. From where their pin bone is, we want everything to be square all the way to the surface and them to have some width of base and some security. Always goes back to, we can't have a big, stout house without having the right kind of solid foundation. And so this is, again, why functionality becomes so important. We'll see this sometimes, cattle being bow-legged, and what will happen is they won't be made right in their hock, and then they'll want to pressure on the outside of their hoof wall, and then that'll wear and tear on their foot. Again, those animals won't have the same kind of longevity built into their skeleton because they're not made properly. You'll see issues like cattle being bigger and puffier in terms of their joint work. Their hock joint will see some swelling, won't have the same kind of hardiness or vigor built into there. And then on the flip side of things, you can see cattle that will pull their hock in from behind. And oftentimes, that is a structure issue. It can also go hand in hand with that animal just being a bit flatter, maybe not having the same kind of muscularity and thickness as they go on through as a couple of the others. We talk about some rear structure from the profile, a 45-degree angle built into their hock, square. This will be too straight, and oftentimes when we make these cattle too straight, they get a bit shallower in terms of their heel and shorter in their toe. They have a harder time withstanding themselves and holding themselves up when they get to a heavier weight. Then on the flip side of things, some things that we've done a good job on as a breed in terms of breeding out of our cattle is making them too sickle-hocked or having some excessive set to their hock and then breaking down in their pastern. Sometimes when cattle get too straight, too, they can do this maneuver in their pastern. Again, we want to avoid that because, again, we have to make sure our foundation is solid and square and strong before we can add the extras. As we start talking about the next piece of the puzzle for functionality, we go into volume. So oftentimes volume is a bit misinterpreted, right? Sometimes when we think of just a good kind of cow having the right kind of volume, we associate it with them just having a really soggy belly that's got the right kind of swoop, really deep bodied. Well, I would challenge you to maybe rethink that, because even though body depth is very important from a balance perspective, what becomes more paramount, and what I think Mr. Judd here at Heritage has done an exceptional job with his Brahman cattle doing, is making sure these cattle have some rib shape. And so where you view that is if you get off to a 3/4 view of their animal, you want to have the right kind of outward cylinder kind of turn to their rib cage. And what happens is when you get that, you're able to facilitate not only a lot more power up high, but it gives them just the right kind of width to go along with it. So they should come out of the top of their spine with some arc and curvature throughout their entire rib cage. And again, this facilitates some doability and performance as well. And what I think is important to remember, and I'll put the microphone. So I'll get back on the microphone for a second. But as we get back to body depth, this is going to be defined by how much depth of body an animal has from their heart back into their flank. They should be deep hearted, they should be soft in their midrib, and they should be equally as soft back in through their rear rib and flank, if not deeper than what's in their heart. And again, this is another key component to facilitating some fleshing ability and some doability, and it also really helps balance and show ring look and presence as well. And so here's some examples of functional versus non-functional, and I think when we get off to this is going to be a semi-bull that we start with, but I think he epitomizes the right kind of structural integrity and still does it with some body. But what I think is important is no matter what breed of cattle we're raising, I'm going to pull up a Brahman picture here next, still having the right kind of foundation and still being sound structured and good bodied is always going to make you neat looking. And so when we flip the script and we go judge a Brahman after that, I think it's important that we see that they still fit. You know, judging exotic cattle, judging continental influence cattle versus judging Brahman cattle should be no different. We still need to make sure they're sound, good beef cattle first that come with the right kind of volume as well. And if there's any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. On the flip side of things, we start studying cattle that maybe aren't as functional. So we look at this guy, and you can see that he's pretty stilty and straight up in his shoulder. We study the top of his shoulder back here. We're straight in our knee. I'm concerned about his skeleton up front. And then we start looking at him in terms of his basic body type, and he's just a bit shallower as well. So if I'm going to predict just the longevity and the doability in this guy versus the semi that we saw first, he's just not going to be as good, he's not going to be as hardy, and he's not going to have the same kind of vigor when we turn him out in a pasture setting. I think when you combine his structure flaws and combine him with his extra frame in relation to his body, well, you're looking at one that you're going to have to baby quite a bit. That's going to require quite a bit more feed, that's going to require quite a bit more maintenance, and that's not going to look probably very good when we go pull him off cows as well. And then this poor old guy right here, I know he's in his working clothes, but I think it's important to see this is a great example of one, even though he's very skinny, that's just a bit flatter-sided, just a bit narrower. And as a result, when we combine that with the fact that he's shallower bodied, we see him out on cows, and he's just not able to maintain his flesh as well as a couple of the others. Again, different stage, not a show bull condition, but still not the same kind of functionality as we saw in Pride. And then here's another example of one that's straight-shouldered, and I thought this was a good example too, because oftentimes if you see cattle and you're struggling to read shoulder angle, because it can be difficult, if you ever see him kind of leaning forward and putting pressure up like he is up here, oftentimes that's a dead giveaway that he's just not made right up front. On the flip side of things, we use functionality to talk a lot about bulls. We can still use it to talk about heifers, but oftentimes when we talk about the female side of things, the word practical is used a bit more. And so again, this Angus cow, I think, epitomizes the right kind of practicality in terms of being sound and good-bodied. And what you'll find oftentimes is in relation to their frame, if their body depth is right and they're sound structured, those cattle will always be able to maintain their flesh and condition better, even when they're not in the show barn, even when they're just out being real-world cows. But we don't lose any quality, and I think those two look like they're cut from the same cloth when we drop down into the Brahman side of things. One that is just absolutely excellent in terms of her rib cage and center body, very good in terms of her angles, very good in terms of her shoulder angle as well. Just a very practical kind of an animal. And I think oftentimes what we need to remember too is when we make their rib cage right and we make their skeleton right, and we just do the basic fundamental cow things like she does very well, well, all of a sudden, we have one that really looks the part as a show cow, too. And so we stick to the fundamental basics. We do those things right. Yeah, they might come with some chest, even though she's not maybe doesn't have that much chest, but they'll still inevitably balance and look the part as well if their rib cage is right and their structure is correct. Same kind of deal here, a very practical Brahman female. And then we dive into this old gal, sale barn special, probably because she's too straight-shouldered, too shallow-bodied, just doesn't look like she'll flesh up and keep the same. And then we dive into this one, and again, an older Brahman cow that's in her working clothes as well, but you can see she's just a bit shallower. She doesn't have the same kind of depth and softness that we saw in the other female. Same could be said about this one. We'll ignore her udder because we'll get to that point in a minute, but just not nearly as practical as the other females that we saw. So then we dive into fleshing ability, and everything kind of builds on each other when we start talking about important selection criteria. But fleshing ability is going to be the ability to naturally maintain body condition without supplemental feed during various climates and seasons. So body condition score, BCS, is going to range anywhere from a 1 to 9, with the ideal being a 5 to 6 in a cow grazing pasture phase. And it's important, and I think as the breed, we've maybe struggled just a little bit, especially with our show cattle, getting them too fat too fast. And I think the repercussions that we've seen is our cattle maybe aren't calving where they should be in the show ring. And so I think really reining that in, really making sure we're not getting our cattle too fat and keeping them at the ideal range is going to be paramount, because what happens when you get your heifers too fat? Well, then it negatively affects their fertility, makes it awfully hard for us to get them stuck. And so something that I think we're continuing to work on as a breed is making sure that we keep our flesh in check and we're not just dumping the feed bucket because it makes them look better. We're strategically kind of doing that to making sure that we're getting them calving their first time in an acceptable time and not doing it too quick, too fast. And so this kind of just breaks down what the condition score looks like. Obviously, condition score 1 is going to be gaunt and close to death. We get down a little bit further, and it's not going to be as good. And I think it also just a rule of thumb, the way cattle will put on flesh and fat is going to be from the front to back, top to bottom. So the last place you'll ever see an animal put on fat is between their hind leg. It'll be either, where their testicles are or where their udder is. And the first place they'll ever kind of start to fill in will be right here down to their chest. So front to back, top to bottom is how animals will lay on condition. And then here's just some examples of cattle in different stages of flesh and condition. As we can see, 1 to 2s are knocking on death's door, and then 8's an awfully happy cow that gets a lot of snacks, and 9, well, that's awfully chubby old gal. Performance is still an important factor, though, that we can't forget about, right? Because at the end of the day, beef will always be sold by the pound. And so higher performing animals tend to also produce and sire heavier weighting calves, which will generate more total revenue whenever those cattle are weighed up. So cattle need to acquire weight and optimum levels of muscle and condition. But in order for them to do that, we know our Brahman cattle are fast growing and hardy, and they'll get there quick. We have to make sure their foundation is right as well so it can withstand it. And so I think also some things that we need to remember too is the number one mistake that's often committed by evaluators or selectors is mistaking frame size for overall weight. So again, and I think Judd's cattle, if we see them when they start showing maybe in the older divisions, they're not going to always be the biggest guys out there. But I promise you, if they cross the scale, they would still be just as good in terms of their weight as those really big framed cattle, because moderate cattle that have more volume, more width, and more substance will weigh more than larger frame cattle that are more one-dimensional, that are flatter and narrower. So just because we see, man, a big old, big bone, big frame kind of a Brahman bull, if he's flatter and he's narrower, well, guys, he's probably not going to have the same kind of performance as one that packs on the right kind of body shape, width, and muscularity as well. And with that extra frame, if his body's not right, we might have just a bit more difficult time maintaining his flesh and condition as well. So I think it's always important to remember that selecting for moderate cattle that do not compromise practical performance never will go out of style and never will lose a guy money as well. So we start talking about muscle in bulls and females, and bulls' power, muscle, dimension obviously is very paramount, right? Because it's your bull's job to supply the power and the performance in the breeding decisions. So they're responsible for it. And so we take a high, really powerful bull to a feminine maternal cow, and we'll always get the right kind of offspring. Also, when we start judging these bulls, especially when they get older, and we talked about some of the flesh and condition issues that we see in the show ring ever so slightly, don't mistake fat for muscle and width. When you get behind the cattle and you watch them go away or you watch them come at you, a fat bull will funnel to the surface. A fat bull won't have the same kind of width and muscularity all the way to the ground. But if you see a bull that's really big topped and really big hipped, if you study him down through his stifle and lower quarter and to the surface, he'll match it, okay? And so always not being deceived by a fat bull for a muscular bull. Females. Obviously, muscle isn't going to be as top on our priority list, but I still think it needs to be talked about. And obviously, we want stout, powerful females. They still need to be wide pinned, they still need to be wide based, and they still need to have some natural dimension, because when we start running into really narrow cows, well, then all of a sudden that pelvis is really narrow, and we might run into some calving issues as well. So, but also in the same breath of things, we want their muscle system to lay on their body cavity in a really long tying and maternal way, because terminal shape that might be round or short or bunchier in design typically will be associated with cattle that maybe don't see the same kind of fertility as a couple of the others and have lower reproductive efficiency. And then just important details to remember: minimum yearling scrotal circumference, about 32 centimeters, give or take. And I know it's different for the Brahman breed than it is for just mainstream cattle. Got to beware of twisted scrotums. Testicular descent becomes really important. And then also making sure at the end of the day, if we're selecting a good kind of breeding Brahman bull, that he still looks like a man, right? He still has some masculinity. He still has some ruggedness. The shape to his skull still reads manly. The shape to his hump still looks like he's a male, and I think that's also very important too. Females, teat and udder design should be clean, balanced, and refined. Gestation signs and breds, you'll see that differently in the show ring. And femininity at the end of the day is a must. Females will correlate that to their udder quality. So if we see a female that maybe isn't as feminine or refined in the shape to her head and neck, when she drops down her first bag, I promise you her udder won't be as pretty as those females who naturally display those secondary sex characteristics of femininity. So obviously we're Brahman breeders, right? We know about different udder problems and flaws, and we're doing, again, an excellent job on fixing it. But we want their udder suspension to be very tight, very pronounced. Again, we don't want their bag to hang low. We don't want their teats to be too coarse or big or long. You guys all calve out Brahman cows, so I don't need to talk to you about udders. We know that. We know those issues. We start getting into bags that are just a bit too loose, obviously really long, coarse teats. And also if they become too gathered, right, that can become an issue as well. So making sure, again, at the end of the day, when we're going out and we're making a big purchase, we're making sure that we still stick to the fundamentals. Again, it's excellent to have a beautiful show heifer, a beautiful show bull. Let's make them real world cows first and a neat looking second. I think these two kind of exemplify what we need to be seeing in pairs. Both have really good udders for the breed. Both are going to wean off pretty heavy calves. Just two nice sets of cows right there. And then the last key to our puzzle that we start talking about is balance. So typically, nicer balanced livestock are more correct in their structure, right? Shoulder angle is always going to be related to length of neck and where it extends out of the top side of their shoulder as well. Hip construction will affect the travel of an animal's rear skeleton, right? And as a breed, I think we've seen when we make them too level out of their hip, what gives, right? They get a little short stepping, they get a little off in terms of their hock. And so Brahmins are naturally supposed to have just a bit of slope to their hip and still could be very balanced and very attractive cattle. Heavier structured livestock, cattle that are bigger boned, that are bigger footed, typically will move with more stability as they get out and go. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the start of the foundation is always going to be their foot quality. Depth of heel, shape of toe, foot size will play a big role in cattle's comfort level in their lower joints. And again, I think this is just a good example of Brahman cattle that kind of do it all, right? Very good in terms of their hoof structure, very good in terms of their basic fundamental soundness and build. And what happens whenever you do that, right? You get a neat looking, good kind of a show animal. So I guess at this point, I'll kind of leave it up to questions. And if anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer them. Alrighty, well, I will turn it over to Aaron.
Thank you, Kylie. So up next, we have PJ Butler, but before that, we're going to do a door prize. We drew for a T-shirt, and so Marco Borbra from Mexico. Oh, yes, you want a T-shirt. So feel free to go back there later, and you can get it. Pick one of the T-shirts we have. Okay.
Okay. You got it, Mr. Barber? Okay.
Okay. You want to take a minute back?
So those of you that registered at the ABBA table in the back, we're doing giving away door prizes. So she'll be calling those out along the way, right?
Yeah. Okay, so up next we have PJ Butler. So PJ was raised on a fifth-generation cattle operation in South Africa. At age 15, he founded Bon Haven Beef Cattle. And between 1996 and 2012, he grew Bon Haven to 5 locations in 3 South African countries. The Hereford, Angus, and Red Angus, Brayford, and Brahman herds achieved much success, winning numerous national shows and setting auction records on the continent. In 2012, PJ relocated to Texas, where the international business manager for Transova Genetics. This position, together with running the annual Champion of the World competition, judging shows, speaking at events, and doing cattle consulting, has taken him to 48 U.S. states and 103 different countries thus far. He has judged 83 different cattle breeds in 42 countries. In 2017, PJ became the first ever cattle judge to judge a national show on all 6 different continents. So let's welcome PJ.
Good morning, guys, and thank you for that very suspicious introduction. Kylie also took most of my speech, so mine's going to be a little shorter than it was going to be. Unless I don't figure this mouse out, then... So
Just click on it right here.
which one? The middle bit?
Yeah, the one on the left side.
Okay. Perfect. Firstly, to the Cullers family, Judd and Gayla and the girls, thank you for this incredible opportunity. Thank you for hosting this group of breeders from around the world and for your hospitality as always. They do an amazing job of bringing the Brahmin world together. I mean, Judd travels extensively with Gala, and they've had an amazing ability to transfer information and genetics literally worldwide and help improve the Brahmin breed that way. They're great friends and really, really good people. So thank you for that invitation and allowing me to be a part of it. A lot of this is introductory. Basically, this graphic just shows that my obsession with the cattle business started at a very young age, I think from conception. That's me watching cattle go through a dip tank at I guess, age 2 or 3, and this is more recently judging an international interbreed in Canada. The right-hand side. Maybe you must stay with me. Yeah? Don't leave me. There we go. I'm going to give you a broad overview of my observations around the world and why I've come to some of the philosophies I've come to. So I'll just touch basically on what I do and where I do it so that you understand why I maybe think a little differently to some people. Like I said, Kylie's talk was so similar to what I'm going to give in terms of the cattle evaluation for functional efficiency that she's allowed my presentation to become a lot shorter. So I appreciate that, and I'm sure you will too. I'm the international business manager for Transover Genetics. So all over the world, I handle Transover's international clients, setting up labs and joint ventures in different countries. Transover's a company that does advanced reproductive technologies, focusing mainly on IVF embryos. We make about 450,000 embryos a year. We do gene editing, cloning, some artificial insemination, and sex semen. And then Tangible Trading Company, top right. It's a company I work with in Dallas that trades commodities internationally, beef and live cattle for slaughter, or dairy cattle for setting up dairies, especially in North Africa and the Middle East. And then my own company, Global Livestock Solutions. Any consulting that I do or traveling around the world, I use that platform. And Wagyu 365 is just a marketing company that I own with 2 guys, and we do two or three Wagyu sales a month. So as you can see, it's pretty broad in terms of the different avenues that I work in. In terms of travel, these are just pictures from around the world. Norway, Romania, and Uruguay, and I'm going to show you a few of these slides. And what I'm going to stress on is that there is no breed of cattle that works everywhere. There's no type of cattle that works everywhere, and it's all about finding cattle that are adapted to certain environments and that are productive and functionally efficient. Top right, you'll see the Brahman bull in Honduras, and then a Charolais cow in Canada, Charolais heifer in Colombia, and then those Herefords in Finland. And you'll see even within breeds, the Charolais cattle are completely different. The Colombian cattle are running close to the equator, very, very hot, humid conditions, and the Canadian cattle are up in the ice and the snow. So we change biotypes accordingly. This is where it started for me. My first ever international consulting job was in a country called Seychelles. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Seychelles. It's probably the most beautiful place in the world, objectively. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs invited me to come and consult on his herd. He's got the largest herd of cattle in the Seychelles. It's in the Indian Ocean, tropical paradise. And he booked me for 7 days. And on the first day, we got out there and saw his whole herd of cows grazing on one pasture overlooking the Indian Ocean. And I had 7 days to evaluate his 22 cows. And I did the best as I could, and 2 hours later I thought we were done. And I explained to him that maybe he could change some management issues, because what he does is every evening he brings all those cattle into concrete stables and locks them up, and then in the morning he lets them go. And I said, this is a waste of human capital. It's a waste. The cattle prefer being out on the pasture, and you're just giving yourself more work to do. And he said, what do you think we make our money from? So I said, well, they're beef cows, so I'm assuming beef is the profit driver. And he said, no, our main driver is when the hotels and resorts come and scrape the manure off the concrete, and we sell fertilizer to them, and that grows the flower gardens and vegetable gardens for them. And their second driver was on some of the islands, you're not allowed to drive cars, so they have these bulls that pull the carts on the islands. The bulls are used for crushing coconuts. And then at the end, they milk the cows just for subsistence purposes. And at the end of their lives, they do process them for beef. So that's when I learned you need to listen before you start talking. So that was a humbling experience, but it was a wonderful experience because I spent 6.5 days on the beach. Now, the bottom right-hand corner, this is a breed called Boran out of Kenya, a high-content Bosindicus breed. So we've managed to send a lot of these cattle to the Seychelles where they've adapted. And it's become a very, very good relationship. And it really was the foundation of me learning to listen before I speak. We all here, from a genetics perspective, we believe in genetics, we're passionate about genetics, we believe that we've set our lives apart for genetics. But I think it's important to realize that it's only 1/8 of the equation. We're not going to solve anyone's cattle operation, fix their problems, or put them on the right track with only genetics. So we're playing in 1/8 of that realm. It's very important, but it's not any more important than herd management or nutrition, animal health. It's not more important than marketing or record keeping or forage management or human capital. These two diagrams, I'll run through them quickly. Just some people take a while to get what I'm saying, so I'm going to do it 3 times. That wheel with 8 spokes, basically each spoke represents one of those 8 divisions I've just mentioned, and the wheel itself is your operation or your farm. If any of those 8 spokes are shorter or longer than the others, it's not a very comfortable ride. You eventually get a flat tire, and then the vehicle doesn't move forward, right? So it's important that we balance those 8 spokes equally if we want to run a profitable exercise. And then this city on the right, that represents a Roman or Phoenician, Egyptian city from those times. And these walled cities, the way they worked is the emperor would sit in the middle of the city in his palace, and he'd have gates facing north, east, south, and west. And he'd have gatekeepers, and each of those gates would have a gatekeeper, and once a week or once every 2 weeks, all the gatekeepers would come to the emperor, and they'd explain to them what the world looks like from their gate. Okay, so then the emperor gets a full view, 360 view of what the world looks like. We're the same, farmers, ranchers around the world. We also emperors that sit in the middle of our farm, in our palace, and we don't like people telling us what to do or when to do it. And those gates are these 8 divisions. If we ignore any of those divisions and don't have a record-keeping gatekeeper or animal health gatekeeper or a nutrition gatekeeper or a genetics gatekeeper, that's where the profit seeps out of our walled city. So it's essential that we keep covering the bases with those 8 cities. So now we're getting into genetics. So we're going to focus on that 1/8 of the big picture. And it's so important that we realize where profitability comes from in cattle. So I've divided the cattle traits into 2 sections. We've got our profit traits and our turnover traits. The traits that are profit drivers are adaptability. If a cow's not adapted to its environment, its genes will never be expressed. Functional efficiency, which is from a physiological standpoint, or with the endocrinology working, or the glandular function working. If they're functionally efficient, that's a profit driver. If they're fertile, it's a huge profit driver. If they live a long time, longevity is a profit driver. So that is what makes us a profit in our industry. Now, the turnover traits, that's what you actually get paid for on that day, are milk and muscle and growth and marbling. But all of those are totally irrelevant if we don't first lay the foundation with our profit traits. I'm going to quickly run through these slides, and this is just to hit home. Sometimes some people see in pictures, some like to read words. Adaptability, those Nelore cows in Brazil are perfectly adapted and in sync with their environment. It's hot, it's humid, they're insects, they're cats. There's all kind of disease and animal trying to kill them. They're adapted and they function in that environment. The Highland cow in Scotland, same thing. It's windy, it's rainy, it's cold. Those cattle are perfectly in sync to the environment. If you flip those cattle, like some Texas farmers seem to want to do every now and then and have a belted Galloway on the Gulf Coast, it's not a very profitable exercise. Functional efficiency, now that's feed efficiency comes into that, but for functional efficiency, it's just the overall efficiency of the cow, like what percentage calf she weans compared with her own body weight, the way she moves, the way she fleshes, and that glandular function that keeps her thrifty and gives her vitality. Feed efficiency from the feedlot standpoint, if we can get these cattle to convert efficiently from feed into live weight or pounds or kilograms, that's an efficiency driver that is extremely profitable from a feedlot standpoint. And remember, this is something that I learned later in my career. We were always told our customers were the buyers of the beef in the restaurants or supermarkets. Those aren't our customers if we cow-calf guys. Our customers are the guys who buy our bulls or buy our calves in the feedlot. So that's what we need to worry about, is the feedlots that buy our calves or the cow-calf guys who buy our bulls. Thinking we've got agency over the customers buying the steak at the end of the day is a pipe dream. That's not realistic. Fertility, 10 times more important than growth. And this is where the animal scientists tend to disagree with me. I believe that fertility is highly heritable. The reason it is highly heritable is because it's a survival trait, right? We wouldn't have cattle like we have cattle today if it wasn't highly heritable. Maybe the animal scientists have been measuring it the wrong way. If you measure it the right way, it's extremely highly heritable. So you think about your cows at home, your most fertile cows have hormonal balance, so they're feminine, and they have high inherent body condition, they're easy fleshing. You put hormonal balance and high inherent body condition together, you equal fertility. It's a very easy math sum, even for people like me who aren't very good at math. And that you can take to the bank, okay? So ease of fleshing is highly heritable, hormonal balance is highly heritable, therefore fertility is highly heritable. So we can have discussion about that afterwards. Longevity is essential. The longer we keep these factories in production and not having to replace them, the more money we keep for ourselves and not having to lay out money in replacing females. And like Kylie said so well, like structural integrity and the composition of these cattle, you can phenotype these cattle and give a pretty good indication of longevity. This is an issue that we are running into in a lot of the popular herds around the world. And I'm going to touch on it briefly, sexual dimorphism versus sexual monomorphism. So what we've realized is in a lot of the popular herds around the world, there's some brands on these cattle, but I'm not going to mention any names. You go into a herd of cows, and the bulls and the cows look exactly the same. They're the same size. The bulls are a little bit feminine. The cows are a little bit masculine. And the reason that's happened is because of selecting for growth and carcass and not selecting for those profit traits. The physiological reason for it is that there are two sets of hormones, right? You've got your growth hormones and your sex hormones. Your sex hormones are what make these cattle fertile and functional. The growth hormones are what make them reach their mature size. The sex hormones only start when the growth hormones stop. So if you're selecting for growth and carcass exclusively, you are selecting against fertility and function. Just simple as that. So as you can see, there's a bull that's slightly feminine and a female that is slightly masculine. And I've heard this said on the microphone at shows or even at auctions, that they'll say, like, this bull, he's a little bit feminine, but he's going to breed good heifers. Incorrect. A feminine bull will breed masculine females because that's the way in which hormonal balance as a trait works. If you want feminine, productive females, you use masculine, rugged bulls with a lot of grunt. Same with the females. If you want to produce those masculine bulls with testosterone and muscle, you use feminine females to do that. A good example, when last did you see a masculine Holstein bull at a dairy? Gustavo Toro. Where's Gustavo Toro? He ran out just in time. But his company makes lots of money out of Holstein bulls, but I want to know how many of them are masculine. And they're not masculine because they're focusing on growth and milk production in the dairy cows, and then they wonder why they get such low AI conception. It's because of those cattle have sexual monomorphism. Sexual dimorphism is what we see here. A bull and a female in mammals should never look the same. Bulls and females have different bodies, they have different looks, they don't look anything the same, and that's what we see in the sexual dimorphism. And the growth hormones versus sex hormones, did that make sense? So your sex hormones start when your growth hormones stop. So your earlier maturing cattle will be more fertile, if that makes sense, and they'll be more moderate framed. Growth, it's a very good turnover trait. We can go extreme though. We can go extreme like that Chianina bull, or we can go extreme like that mini Galloway heifer. I think probably where we need to be is slap bang in the middle of that when it comes to growth from a sustainability standpoint. Muscle's the same. You know, we've got these Belgian blues on the left and the Wagyu in Japan on the right. We probably need to be slap bang in the middle of those two examples when it comes to how much muscle we need on these cattle. That's our product, but remember, muscle is a turnover trait, not a profit trait. Milk. Belgian blue female on the left, she's dry, but just by looking at her, you know she's not going to milk very well because she's got no hormonal balance and she's over-muscled. And on the right, beautiful Holstein cow, but just imagine she was a beef cow. She's going to give us too much milk to sustain herself. So she's not going to rebreed. Her energy requirements are going to be too high. She won't ever reach her energy requirements in a beef setting. So too much milk can also be an issue. So again, we want to be slap bang in the middle of those two extremes when it comes to milk. Marbling, very similar. Remember, our customer is the feedlot that buys our steers or the producer that buys our bulls. When you drive marbling too far and too hard, you're not getting rewarded for it. They might think they're rewarding you with a little bit of a premium, but I think there's a balance there. There's a balance between these two. The Wagyu guys can get away with it because they can add that incredible premium to their cattle when they sell it, but for most people, in most places, most of the time, the profit in marbling is going to be slap bang in the middle of those two things. We know from a philosophical standpoint what happens to cattle when you single trait select for marbling is you get a Wagyu, okay? I don't think Wagyu is what the industry needs outside of that 1% like little niche market. All over the world, I get asked what size should a cow be? It's a great question. And please ignore the actual numbers. It's more the principle behind those numbers, okay? So step one, if you want your cows to be the right size, you give them the appropriate amount of nutrition. So you don't spoil them and you don't starve them, okay? Just what the commercial guys are doing in your area, you keep those cows in good body condition and a functional condition. In most areas in the US, and I'd go as far as to say most areas around the world, there certainly are exceptions. We probably should be calving these cows at 2 years old. I know we don't like it because our cows don't get as big as we'd like them to be, but if we can calve at 2 years old, it's financially rewarding because you get a calf earlier, and B, you get a female that lives longer. She's better in her joints, her udder holds up better because it doesn't have too many fat deposits, her sexual organs aren't overly done with fat deposits, and keeping an animal from breeding when it's in estrus, when it's cycling, is going against nature. Let them breed when they're ready to breed, and they'll reward you for that. Now, there are areas that are very marginal in terms of climate and environment and nutritional availability, and then you can make a very good case for 3 years old. But then all you do is you move that from 27 months to 39 months. Conceive in a 90-day breeding season. That's a good start. I think it's essential to have these breeding seasons to create contemporary groups and manage your cattle and force them to be profitable. Once you start doing that for long enough, 90 days becomes 45 days eventually, and then you'll realize that all your best cows were calving within 45 days anyway. You do that annually and on time, establish a minimum weaning weight at, say, 7 months. So what that does is it stops your cows from getting too small. So let's say in this area, just 500 pounds, 550, whatever. I mean, I'm just throwing numbers out there. When you establish that minimum weaning weight that's acceptable, then your cows don't get too small. And your calf must be at least 45% of the cow's weight at 7 months. That stops your cows from getting too big, and then you've got an efficient factory. Now, if you do all of that, in 3, 4, 5 years' time, the cows that have jumped through all those hoops, you give them a special tag. They're the cows that you breed your bulls and your replacement heifers from. Every one of those cows is the right size. Okay, that's the size that a cow should be. Okay. Evaluating structure and phenotype, I'm not going to repeat too much of what Kylie said. I think she did a tremendous job of this. But basically, cattle must eat, walk, reproduce. Okay, that's the fundamentals. Secondly, and I mentioned, sorry if any of you watched the Brayford show last night, you would have heard this then too, so I apologize for repeating myself. But focus on the four most important economic traits, like I said now: fertility, longevity, adaptability, functional efficiency, and then you build on those turnover traits after that: milk, muscle, growth, and depending on what situation you're in, what breed you're in, what country you're in, if you need marbling or not. And then this is also important to me: quality cattle come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, depending on environment, depending on markets. And then you've got to fit those cattle to A, your objectives, what you want to do with your program; B, your resources, what you've got to give those cattle; and thirdly, your environment. Okay, this is a soapbox of mine that I jump on from time to time. High inherent body condition, or fat, is it good, bad, or ugly? Now, in North America, on the EPD runs, or EBVs, we penalize fat, okay, because the feedlots want big, lean cattle, okay? In Australia and New Zealand, they reward fat, okay, because they know that the cattle guys, the cow-calf guys have to make a profit too, right? Why fat is so important, or high inherent body condition, is these easy fleshing cattle mature quicker, they forage better, they're more fertile, these cattle have better temperaments, and it's a better eating experience when it comes to tenderness when that steak hits the plate. Those are the pros when it comes to cattle with high inherent body condition. So those harsh cattle that are hard doing, that get big but are late maturing, they don't do any of that very well, but they do make the packers a lot of money. But our client is not the packer. Our client is the feedlots or our bull buyers. Just like Kylie said, it's balance. It's putting all these things together. So what we want to do is find the most average animal possible, okay? Like we've made a mistake from time to time in chasing outliers, cattle that are extreme in any one direction. If we can keep propagating and breeding these average cattle that have got no holes in them, no genetic disadvantages, that do everything right but in the right proportions, then that average makes profit. Average doesn't get headlines in the newspapers or on Facebook, but average is a very, very profitable idea. Okay, from an opportunity standpoint, this is just global macro scale. The world is enjoying beef, and it's driving from the Southeast Asia. China is consuming a lot more beef than they have before. They are at about 3 kilos a day per person, 6 pounds per day per year per person. Yeah, 3 pounds per day per person is what I eat. But the Chinese do that in a year. They're going to double that in 5 years. And just that double times 1.4 billion people would need a cattle economy the size of Brazil to maintain. So from a macro scale, the demand is going up. The supply can't go up because we've pretty much maximized how many cattle we can run. So we are going to start seeing more profit for our cattle for most people in most places. One way of ensuring this profitability, we spoke about this at dinner at length last night, is to open up these non-traditional export markets that have a demand for beef. Because what that does is it nullifies your packers. So your Tyson, Cargill, National, JBS can do nothing about it when you've got an export avenue to lift that price. And similar situations in a lot of countries. Even in the US, we've got more practitioners. Like the average herd size in the US, about 29 cows. Cows are becoming fewer. We lost 3 or 4 million cows in the last 2 years in the drought, so we're down to like 88 million cattle now. The price of beef is going to go up. From a messaging standpoint, we're also in a very sweet spot. On the left, we've got the white-tailed deer, or you can put salmon in that bracket, very humanely raised, right? Like if you're eating a whitetail or eating a salmon that's wild caught from Alaska or Norway, that is as humanely a way to eat animal protein. But we're not going to feed 8 billion people with salmon and white-tailed deer. So it's not going to happen. On the right, we've got sustainable. Chickens and pigs, we can feed 8 billion people with chickens and pigs, but the elite urban centers around the world, they would deem that inhumane, okay? So we've got a very special place in the market with beef, cattle, sheep, and goats. We're humane and sustainable. I think it's maybe an idea to move that message forward into our markets. What are our challenges? One of our big challenges is subsidies, okay? So those are miniature Highland and Galloway cattle. The Norwegians call every so often wanting genetics of these miniature cattle because they get subsidized per head. And if you can run double the amount of cattle, you get double the amount of subsidies. But it creates an artificial market. It's not a real cattle market. So that becomes a challenge. And then with carbon tax, that's causing even bigger issues because they're trying to get the cattle numbers down 25% in the EU. So what they're going to do, they're going to have the same amount of pounds on their pastures. They're just going to have bigger cows to make up the loss of 25% that they're trying to bleed out. It creates artificial markets. Quotas is the same. In Belgium, they've got a quota system where you have to have a certain amount of cattle that you're only allowed on your property. So if you're only allowed to have 18 cows, you're going to have the 18 most extreme cows possible. So like these Belgian blues, all the calves come out the side. They can only have 3 calves, and they send the cow to slaughter. It's not a really good, functional, sustainable model. Communism, this was in Cuba, Brahman bull, and as you guys can see, he's not the worst Brahman bull you've ever seen, not the best Brahman bull, but that was my grand champion in Cuba. The next day they sold him for $400, and the guy said, well, it doesn't actually make a difference. It's just one Castro bank account into another one. But what happens is, because there's no initiative for these guys to breed better cattle, they don't breed cattle anymore. They just multiply them. So you don't actually improve these genetics at all. And that's what communism does, is it retards our ability to improve our markets. Socialism, this is the Pampas in Argentina, just one of the most amazing places on earth for raising cattle. And what happened there is President Cristina Kirchner, back in her first go-around, she flirted quite heavily with socialism. And she thought it would be a wonderful idea to make beef cheap for the people in Argentina. And, it's a noble idea, isn't it? So, like we said earlier, these farmers are not stupid. Eh? Like we are philosophers and scientists and kings. That's just who we are. So they're not stupid. They weren't going to produce cheap beef for people when they can move all those beef off the pampas and plant soybeans for China. So what happened is, in her tenure, her first tenure, Argentina went from 60 million cattle to 50 million cattle. And what happened to the beef price in Argentina? Higher than it had ever been before. So social engineering never works when it comes to creating good commodity prices. Wars and political unrest can cause a lot of trouble as well. These are Dinka cattle and a Dinka herdsman in South Sudan. Very proud cattle culture, but in order to protect their cattle, they have to carry these weapons around, and they're always having to find less favorable grazing areas so that they don't get attacked by terrorist groups. Actually, not too different to Texas. They love their guns and they love their cows, but I don't think we must take the shirts off too many of the Texas ranchers, because it's a different body type. It's not the same body type. EPDs and genomics. This can be a wonderful thing and it can be an awful thing. And I'll try to wrap this up so I don't get too technical on it. But basically, genomically enhanced EPDs and EPDs or EBVs, depending on where you are in the world, it's an incredible invention. It's a Rolls Royce, right? If it's used correctly and everyone is measuring everything honestly, accurately in large numbers all the time, then that machine works. It really, really works well, and it's a very useful tool if you're first selecting on phenotype and using pedigrees and using in-herd ratios, etc. But we all know that not everyone is measuring everything honestly, accurately in large numbers all the time. So what's happened is this Rolls-Royce, the driver hasn't got a license, okay, who's driving this Rolls-Royce. So these marketers who try and promote all these high EPDs, top 1% for any given trait you can imagine, they are, what they're doing with this is, well, they not just don't have a license, they're also intoxicated, and they're driving they're going to drive this Rolls-Royce off the cliff. So I think we need context and nuance when it comes to reading these EPDs and know who's measuring, what the population groups are, and if they really are doing it properly. Here's an example of it being done properly. That's Professor Dorian Garrick from New Zealand. He did a study on Angus in the US from 1980 to 1997. And he found that the average steer in a feedlot in the US, Angus steer, was making $144 more over that period. That's a huge win for EPDs and genomics, because they were single trait selecting for growth and carcass, right? They won. They did it. In that same time, the average cow, Angus cow in the US, cost $136 more to raise per year, okay? So if you're a cow-calf guy, like my people are, you lose $136 so that someone else that you don't know can make $144. It's just not a good deal. And this is where this whole process can run amok. Either it cannot be accurate, and sometimes if it's accurate, people are chasing it in the wrong direction. So let's say, for example, could you agree that the average cow in America is big enough? Okay? Who thinks they're too small? Okay, the average cow in the... Okay, we're going to chat later, a long chat. The average, so let's accept that it's big enough. Then the average yearling weight EPD should be good enough, right? But have you ever heard a sale manager marketing an animal for having an average yearling weight EPD? Never in a million years. At the Brahmin sale tomorrow night, do you think they're going to stand up there and go, this animal, you must buy it because it's average for weaning weight or yearling weight or milk? But that's actually what we want if we want to make a profit, but they're not going to do it. Recreation. We've all dabbled in this drug from one point in time or another. An incredible sport, an incredible opportunity for younger people to get involved in our industry. But it's vital that almost everything that's learned during that time is forgotten when we get into production agriculture, because there are a lot of bad habits getting taught in that recreational side of our industry. We have allies in this industry that we might not be aware of, and it might be time to start linking shields with them. So the genetically modified organisms community, they get black eyes and blood noses all the time, from the media, from the elites, from the celebrities. This is just a map of how many people have died over the last 30 years from eating GMOs, and this is a color map. It's not a black and white map. As you can see, there's no one who's died yet, and yet they make it seem like keeping these 8 billion people alive is some form of a sin. I had Jack Russells at home. I'd 5 Jack Russell Terriers. They used to sleep in my bed with me. But you know, when you feed a Labrador, you put the food in the bowl, and that Labrador starts licking the bowl before the food even gets into the bowl. A Jack Russell's the opposite. A Jack Russell, you can give it a filet mignon Wagyu steak, and it still stares at you for about a minute before it starts eating, as though you're trying to poison it. And the people, we're trying to feed 8 billion people, and they're looking at us like Jack Russells, as though we're trying to poison them. And I think it's essential that we get on the front foot and the offensive when it comes to speaking to these guys and celebrating what we do instead of apologizing how we do it. The fossil fuels industry, oil, natural gas, coal, these guys are very, very much part of what we do. Okay, we produce food. They are the food of food. Without fossil fuels, we're making no food. Okay, so there's a statistic that comes from a book called Fossil Future by Dr. Alex Epstein, and what they've measured, there'd be about 1.2 billion people go into starvation mode if the new Green Deal came true and fossil fuels got ripped out of the world's economy. That's not a moral statement to want it to be gone. I mean, who wants 1.2 billion people to go back into starvation? For now, for 2023, this is a vital part of what we're doing. And honestly, the only way that we, and this comes from traveling and observing, the countries in the world that are flourishing are the ones that have embraced fossil fuels. The countries in the world that are wealthy are the ones that take care of their environment, okay? If you go to Japan or New Zealand or South Korea or Canada, or Norway or Sweden, they've embraced all of this. They've embraced fossil fuels and they've industrialized fully, and the environment is immaculate. Why? Because the people are wealthy. The thing we need to do first is make as many people in the world as wealthy as possible, and wealthy people take care of what they have because they actually own it. And I think that this is an argument that we're going to be having seriously in the next few years. Another example, there are two Manhattans here, Manhattan, New York, and Manhattan, Kansas. Two very different Manhattans. Manhattan, New York doesn't really like the way that we raise cattle in Manhattan, Kansas, because these cattle are not flourishing and eating green grass, and there are no birds singing, and they're not drinking out of streams. They're eating a total mixed ration that's put in front of them. Their water gets clean, but it's piped to them in a trough. Their shade isn't trees, it's shade cloth. So it's not natural, and they're grouped together in bunches. They're not wild and free. So they don't approve of the way in which we're creating this beef by getting these cattle into confinement for 150 days. Manhattan, New York, the complainers, the protesting class, they also not hunting and gathering for fruit and nuts and fishing for their food. They go to the corner store and get their total mixed ration from the pizza place. They also have pen riders, like the feedlots do. Every corner is a pharmacist or a doctor that they go to keep them safe. All the mechanisms to keep these cattle cool, like that shade cloth, or warm, or sheltered from wind, they've got air conditioning in their rooms. Manhattan, New York is a feedlot that these people have decided and tried to go and live in themselves. No one's forced them to do that, but they've taken it upon themselves to live in that feedlot, which mirrors this feedlot almost identically. There's no difference between them, but they still complain about the way that their food is created. Extremely confusing for me, coming from the bottom side of the world, where we live upside down our whole lives because we're on the south. So the blood goes to our head, so we don't often think clearly, but this didn't make any sense to me. So my grandfather always told me, when you're in public and you don't know everyone you're speaking to, there are three things you don't talk about: religion, politics, and sex, okay? So we're not going to talk about sex because it's really boring. So we're going to talk about religion and politics. So that, on the top left, that's a fence in certain parts of southern Africa where it's become a little bit dangerous. A lot of the producers fence their homes in for security purposes. This also makes it a little more difficult to be productive, right? Because you're enclosing yourself, and these are challenges in a lot of parts of Latin America, Southern Africa, where security becomes an issue, and it's very much linked to the political situations there. Religion, top right, that's in India, where in most states, except for two, eating beef is illegal, or slaughtering cattle is illegal as well. So what they do with their male calves is they just kick them out on the street. The cows that dry up and aren't lactating anymore, they kick them out on the street, and they eat the food that's supposed to be for 1.5 billion people. So they're eating the people's food, and the people aren't allowed to eat them. The cattle are sacred in India. This is a huge challenge, but fortunately, the Indians are as sacred as the cattle are. The rupee that they trade with is more sacred. So what they do is they've managed to find an illegal route which is accepted to move all these bulls into Bangladesh, where Bangladesh is more than happy to consume their sacred cows. So fortunately, that rupee is sacred. The bottom left, that's a big ship. Now, in the Middle East, all the way from Turkey, all the way into the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, at the end of Ramadan, during Eid, they need cattle for animal sacrifice, and they need to be in live form, okay? But they don't have any cattle in the region to do that, so that's opened up an opportunity to move cattle from all over the world. There's a ship going from Brazil. Some of these ships carry 25,000 cattle. There's ships that carry almost 100,000 sheep that have come from Australia. And what that does is it creates an opportunity to supply those needs in those markets, but just by sending animals on live carriers. We've got two big challenges when it comes to competition with our product. The one is the lab-grown beef. Genetically, it is beef. They're producing this beef accurately to where it mirrors what we produce off pasture. They're running into three issues, though. The one issue is it's way too expensive. I don't know people who can afford, I think where they're at now, like on average, like $20,000 a pound. That's a little too much for my friend group. The second thing is that traditionally these middle classes around the world in Central South America, that East Africa belt, the Asian countries, China, Eastern Europe, they're getting into the middle class. They don't want to eat a lab-grown piece of protein. They want to do it like it's always been done. They're lifting themselves into that realm and that economy, and they didn't work their whole lives to eat something that isn't real and tangible. The third issue they have is the amount of energy it takes to produce lab-grown beef turns the whole thing upside down, because the same people that don't want fossil fuels want lab-grown beef, but it takes so much fossil fuels to make lab-grown beef is they've got themselves caught in a catch-22, sorry. 23 was the bonus. Then we've got these Impossible Burgers, which is very well named. So an Impossible Burger, I like knowing what the other people are doing, so I've had one. And the reason it's called an Impossible Burger is because it's the only product that is more expensive and also it's unhealthy and it doesn't taste good. I mean, normally unhealthy things taste good, right? But this is unhealthy and doesn't taste good. So it's an Impossible Burger. And the US market has rejected it. They've had 2 runs at it, and the US market still wants the real deal. So I think we've overcome that. Just a little tagline. I know all of you know this, but I've got wonderful vegan and vegetarian friends. The one thing I keep reminding of them is that their diet kills a lot of animals, because when they plowed up the pampas, they killed the earthworms, they killed all the rodents that were underground, they killed the birds, they killed the foxes, they killed everything. So a vegan vegetarian diet does not kill animals. They kill them plenty. They just don't kill the cute ones. Climate and environment, we often get accused as being the climate deniers. We don't believe in global warming. We don't believe that climate is changing. I haven't met anyone who doesn't think the weather and climate is changing. This is a nuanced question. I think it's one that we need to engage with people with it. I think our argument needs to be what approach to solving these issues, or not just solving them, but learning to adapt to live with these issues, is going to encourage the most human flourishing. Because that's what we want to do. We want to flourish. We want the most humans to flourish. The idea of minimal human impact, which means that the mere fact that we're alive and on the planet means that it's like a sin from birth to be here, because we're affecting the planet negatively. This isn't going to help anyone, and the people who want less population, who are they going to start with? I mean, ask them, like, who gets knocked out first? It's not a feasible option. So when someone calls you a climate denier, just ask them for more context about what they're talking about. So like if someone said to me, did I play sport at university? My answer is yes, but I'm not telling you anything, because there's no context, right? I could have been a lawn bowler, or I could have been a bare-knuckle boxer. You don't know. There's more to this conversation than it takes. Very important. So the global pasture area around the world is about 40 to 60%. and there's only three things we can do with it. Either we can leave it and let it rot, but the poisonous gases that get emitted by that are terrible, or we can burn it, and that's carbon dioxide, that's not good, or we can graze it and get a really good animal protein product that is plentiful, reliable, and affordable from that. I go with option 3. Or we can build golf courses, but that's more boring than sex. This is just some interesting facts as we tail off here. There are 5 countries in the world that have 75% of the cattle in the world. So it's very consolidated. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is what it is. So India's got 330 million, Brazil 220, China 130, USA down to just under 90 now, Argentina 50. But every country in the world either eats beef, drinks milk, produces cattle, or does all 3 of those. This is a global industry. We are one industry when it comes to all of this. The US is still the number 1 producer of beef in the world, even though we only 4th in cattle numbers, and this is where efficiency comes into it. Efficiency of systems and production so that we can feed these 8 billion people. Kylie covered that very well. These are just quick examples of animals that can eat, walk, and reproduce. You see the bull on the left, good angles on his shoulder and hind leg, good testicles on that bull. Bull on the right, really straight-shouldered and straight through his hind leg, small testicled bull. He's not going to do those fundamentals right. Udder quality, again, this is an essential part of breeding cattle from a longevity standpoint and a functional efficiency standpoint. We need to get these udders tight and above the hocks, get those 4 udders blending into the body wall, get those teats manageable so when those calves are born they can latch onto those teats and get a good feed of colostrum from the start. The cow on the right has a collapsed udder floor, no 4 udder attachment into the body wall. She hasn't got much longer to go in that herd. Highly heritable too. Skull shape is maybe something that as cattle people we might have ignored for a little too long. It's essential that we put good heads on these bulls and these females. Bulls with masculine heads, females with feminine heads, big jaws, big muzzles, width between the eyes, appropriately length skulls. So a short skull is very, very early maturing, and a long skull is late maturing. And this plays into so many. Like that small little high eye, any of you who have horses, those are the wild ones, right? And with a narrow skull. Small jaw, small muzzle, narrow pinned. Long nose, late maturing. No throat latch, no softness or ease of fleshing. So I think when we look holistically at these cattle, it's important to make sure we start at the head and the head follows, because that bull on the left, you can just see by looking at him that he is early maturing, he's fertile, he's a bull that has plenty of testosterone in him, he's got some width to him as you look at his muzzle, and it's going to be a good eating experience. There's tenderness in those skulls. Adaptability, this Hereford bull on the right, you can see the length of that scrotum. That scrotum neck lengthens to try and cool down the testicles. So when cattle are tropically degenerating, the first thing that happens to these bulls is their testicles get long. So you'll see your adapted bulls have always got well-suspended testicles. On the left, you see better suspended testicles in the Brangus bull with a tidy sheath. And as Kylie said, foot quality is essential. Feminine wedge shape, the Angus cow. What do we want? We want cows with a face like a princess and a butt like a cook. Okay, so if you put those 2 things together, you get a cow like that. That Wagyu cow, you can see she's deep-chested, tight-flanked, and she doesn't quite give you that feminine wedge. Her hormonal balance is off, and that's also what happens when you single trait for 1 trait, marbling in that case. Maternal and terminal body types. There's places in the market for both types of cattle, depending on what your objectives are. The maternal types will be easier fleshing, deeper sided, and less cylindrical through the middle, like this Blondie Aquitaine bull. He is more terminal, so it's rounder in his muscle, drier over the rib cage, more cylindrical through his middle. So he can work in a terminal feedlot system, but you wouldn't want his daughters on an extensive cattle operation. Temperament is an economic trait. It's so important from a human capital standpoint for our families, for our workers, for our neighbors, for our clients, to make sure that these cattle are even-tempered and that we're ruthless in culling the wild ones. Hide color and its effects on infrared and ultraviolet rays, just basically these gray, silver colored cattle like the gray Brahman are ideally suited for this sea level where the infrared is very, very strong, and it's because they reflect a lot of the infrared rays. On the opposite side, the black cattle are very, very good at high altitude where the ultraviolet is very strong. They can absorb that ultraviolet and actually use it. Black cattle at sea level or on more savanna areas like those red cattle absorb too much heat, and they don't have the ability to dissipate that heat, because often, like these Angus cattle, don't have enough skin either, so they can't sweat, and they're absorbing too much heat. So matching hide color to climate, environment, and altitude is essential. Your rule of thumb, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or more average per year, you don't want to have black cows. Hair coats in summer and winter. We really need cattle to slick off early in the spring. The cattle that slick off first are the fertile cows. Those fertile females are the ones that keep you in business. The ones that hold their hair, basically what's happening as the light hits those cattle, the pituitary gland tells the pineal gland in the brain, tells the gonads it's time to get in to start cycling, and they shed their hair. The cattle that hold their hair are generally going to be the ones that calve later in the season and they become subfertile. But in cold areas, you want them to grow that hair in the winter. What sheds and grows hair is not heat, it's light. So that's why often in areas that are hot but have a very similar day-night, the daylight hours are similar in winter and summer, they often get away with cattle that don't shed very well. Now your extremes, like if you get into southern Argentina or up into Canada, northern US, those cattle actually shed very well because they get 20 hours in the day, daylight in summer, so they have to be able to shed in order to be productive. And the same, they have to be able to grow hair as well. Pigmentation on cattle like the Simmental or the Hereford, it's essential to put pigmentation on these cattle's extremities, on the testicles, the teats, and on the eyes. And the reason for that too is just reflection from snow in the cold areas or that infrared that hits the eye. And we've come up with every argument under the sun why we don't need pigmentation, but it's as simple as this. That infrared hits the eyelid, the eye starts tearing because it's uncomfortable. It's basically a magnifying glass. Once that sun hits the tear, starts burning the eye, and a few years after that, you've got sores or cancer from that. The quick fix with that is put sunglasses on. And this is physics. I mean, this is not my opinion. And it all correlates. From the head to the tail, these things all fit together. There's no such thing as a good bull with a bad head or a good cow with a bad head. From the head to the tail, these things all fit together very, very well. And we want them to be balanced. We want the most average animal, and we want to propagate those average genetics over and over again, and that's where we get our consistency. Average is a great thing when it comes to profitability. Any questions? Yes. Yeah, so what I said there is that we must ignore those numbers. It's just an example. So if your area is favorable to growing cattle to 60% of their mature weight by the, say, 15 months, it doesn't matter if they're Bos Indicus or Bos Taurus. Because the bank manager, like when you go to your bank manager, does he say, oh, I'll lend you money because you have Brahmins, but I wouldn't lend the guy money because he's got Angus? It doesn't work like that. We're in the cattle business. So what I've seen what the Brazilians have done with Nelore, they're breeders there that are carving their whole cow herd at 2 years old. Nelore, that's the extreme of Indicus, okay? And they're fertility testing all their bulls at 9 months old. And if there's live sperm, those bulls go into the breeding program. So the hard answer is yes, even if it is Indicus, but you've got to apply brute force to it and be ruthless. Now, if we did that from day one, if we haven't been doing it, we might lose 80% of our cow herd in the first year. So I'm not saying cull those, but identify the ones that can do it 2 years old and propagate those genetics. Because if we don't want to make a profit, then we don't ever have to calve our cows. But if we actually want to make a profit, it doesn't make sense to hold them out for longer if our environment is good enough. So like where I came from, a lot of the areas around there, we couldn't get a female to grow to 60% of her mature weight by 15 months, a lot of the areas around us. So then either you have to change your body type and your breed, or you go to 3 years old to do it. So it's not hard and fast, but if you've got good enough land, whether it's Indicus or Taurus doesn't really matter, you know. But I think they're in this group, this is a unique group because it's Indicus heavy. In this group, I think there are enough examples in the tropics and subtropics around the world where a 3-year-old animal probably is more feasible because you're getting that extra 5 years of longevity on the other end, if that makes sense. I know I gave you a political answer, but it's complicated. I mean, it's not a yes or no. Yeah. And what is the other question?
So, where can I find more information about the color, the relation of color and
So that was done at Texas A&M in the 1950s and 60s, and it's documented in the Wortham lectures. If you give me your email address, I can send you the information on that. Yeah, and it's just physics on light and its effects on radiation and reflection and absorption. Very good. Is there anyone else? Or good. Thank you so much, guys, and yeah, thanks again to the Colors family.
Hey, thank you, PJ. We really appreciate you being here. PJ is really good about, if you have questions, you need further information, of sharing the knowledge that he has. And I'm sure, PJ, if you guys want to talk to him in a little while, send him your email address and he'll forward some of that information. Megan Beale from Australia. Are you inside right now, Megan? You've won a door prize. Can you see Kristen back here at the registration desk? She's going to hook you up. Bo from Thailand, door prize winner. See Kristen in the back and pick up a door prize. And we have one more, Cheryl Greiner from Texas. Is she around? Pick up a door prize back in the back. Order of business. I don't know if you guys picked up one of these trifolds. If you did and you opened it inside, you see it's 12 o'clock. We're going to break for lunch in a minute. But before we do, if I could have your attention to the guys over here in the corner and Judd's new hat. He's not here to wear it. He'll be wearing it tomorrow at the show. Let me, if you will, give your attention to Bronco Sioux. And they also are called Olympia Creek hats.
Ok, muchísimas gracias por prestar atención. Ok, mucho mejor. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por prestar atención a las presentaciones. Ya como pueden ver son las 12:15, ya vamos a almorzar ahorita y vamos a tener hasta la 1 de la tarde para poder almorzar. Me gustaría que puedan poner su atención hacia los caballeros que están hacia la derecha. Ellos son una compañía que hace sombreros a su talla.
So these guys over here brought their equipment. They can shape your hat if you have one on your head and make it just the right shape for you. But here's the really unique thing. They are custom hat makers. They will measure your head. They'll design the hat in the material that you want, and they ship to anywhere in the world. So if you guys are interested at all in a cowboy hat that actually fits your head and is the correct shape for your face, today is your lucky day. These guys usually just set up a display at the NFR in Las Vegas. They were very gracious to come here to Hungerford and be with us today.
Los caballeros que están aquí a la derecha han viajado por todo Estados Unidos para poder hacer sombreros en varios sitios. Si tienen algún interés en un sombrero hecho a mano, hecho a su talla, perfectamente moldeado a su cabeza, ellos son las personas que le pueden ayudar. La ventaja que ellos tienen, aparte de muchos de los vendedores aquí en Estados Unidos, es que pueden mandar los sombreros a cualquier parte del mundo. Así que si tienen un momento de su tiempo, pasen hacia allá los pueden saludar y les pueden contar un poquito más de los productos que ellos venden.
Is there anything else that you'd like me to add about your service? You do felt hats? Yes, felt hats like Judd. Just so you know, have you guys seen Judd in his black cowboy hat before? He's had that hat for about 20 years, and we keep purchasing new hats, and they don't match up. He is incredibly excited to have this silver belly. Is this silver belly hat? And you'll probably see it in the ring this week. So thank you guys for being here. That's next. We are going to be serving barbecue outside on the table. If you want to, as you have time, make your way through there. If you also look here, we're going to try to get back on schedule at 1 o'clock. We will do our interview with Carlos Lee. We'll be here. We'll have a short presentation from PJ. And then we'll do our International Breeders Panel, which I'm super excited about. If you're a member of the panel, if you will come up here when we dismiss, we're going to get organized so everyone knows what we're doing. Yeah.
Ok, primero antes de que vayan a almorzar, por favor los panelistas que van a estar presentando a la 1:30, si pueden pasar adelante, que tenemos que hablar un poquito del plan de la entrevista. Lo segundo sería el almuerzo. Si por favor pueden salir aquí a su mano derecha, van a conseguir que les compramos barbecue para que puedan almorzar. Vamos a tratar de regresar al itinerario que estábamos antes, así que si pueden tratar de comer rápido, disculpen la molestia, vamos a tratar de empezar otra vez a la 1 de la tarde. Así que muchísimas gracias. Pregunta sobre el almuerzo. Okay.
Hey everybody, Victoria Lambert here. We're behind the scenes, and we are here at Heritage Cattle Company for their International Field Day, the ABBA International Field Day. We're having a great time. We're taking a lunch break, and we will be back shortly. So stay tuned, stay close to your Facebook. We're going to have a lot more for you to watch, especially that international panel of speakers. I think it'll be great. Look forward to seeing you in about an hour.